Hi, I'm Drew D'Amelia, and last year you might remember that I wound up watching 100 movies from 2017 and talked about each one of them, which was quite a bit of effort. This year, however, I effortlessly wound up watching 125 movies from 2018. And I don't feel like talking about all of them, so instead I'm going to do a top 20 most remarkable movies of 2018. These aren't necessarily the best movies of 2018, a lot of my favorites don't even make it onto this list. Rather, it's the movies that I feel I have the most to talk about, and it's done in no particular order. So, let's get into it.
Ralph Breaks the Internet. I think the internet is an exceptional setting for a fantasy adventure, and I really put my faith in Disney to pull it off. I really liked Wreck-It Ralph, and Disney was on a winning streak. Their days of making shitty sequels were behind them. Except when I thought about it, I realized they hadn't actually made a great sequel yet. And this movie was, unfortunately, no exception. While the animation is great and the theme is bold, you just don't see that kind of effort in the other aspects of the movie. The places in the internet this movie chose to visit were really bland, and there were a lot of obvious and distracting lapses in logic. And the referential humor was consistently cringeworthy, with the princesses being so brutal to sit through that their second appearance made my nose bleed. That's not a joke. Incredibles 2. I never really wanted a sequel to The Incredibles. I wouldn't mind one if the story felt different enough, and this really didn't. I didn't mind watching great action sequences. The superhero family is still a fun idea, and we got to explore a little bit more with that, mostly from the mundane parenting stuff, but with powers angle. But the story itself felt too familiar. I definitely had a good time. I just would have liked to have a better time. But hey, everyone finally got the fucking sequel they kept yelling about. Are you happy now? Tag. I was having such movie fatigue when I was going to see this movie. The reviews were so-so, and I was so tired of seeing middling movies, especially comedies. I almost wanted to give up on movies entirely. But I forced myself to watch this, and I was blown away with how entertained I was. We finally have a modern comedy that has a cohesive style of humor. The joke is people taking the playful game of tag far too seriously, a joke I'm a big fan of, and they mercifully adhere to this style throughout the whole movie instead of uncomfortably changing things up. And the idea of grown-up friends sticking together, no matter the distance, and letting themselves have such energetic fun isn't just enjoyable to watch, but it's also something that's very meaningful to me. The story even leaned into the emotional aspect of its premise, and that really got to me. So yeah, Tag apparently made me believe in movies again. Peter Rabbit. This looked so awful. The idea of taking a wholesome, gentle idea and turning it into a loud, brash one is deeply uncomfortable, especially when it's particularly beloved. I'm barely familiar with Peter Rabbit, but I was feeling sorry for him. And yeah, I don't think this movie did the source material any justice at all. But if you can get past that, there's actually some excellent slapstick antics in here. Domhnall Gleeson turns out to be extremely good at physical comedy, and it's worth seeing this movie for his performance alone. I just assumed this movie would have nothing of value, but it works on its own merits. 3 Identical Strangers. Sometimes I like to go into movies cold, and the only thing I even knew about this movie was its poster. I took a chance on it, and I was blown away. I almost don't want to say anything about it so people can have the same experience that I had, but I guess you're already looking at footage from this trailer right here, so I've kind of ruined that. I'd say that the less you know, the better. This movie winds up going to so many places that you just aren't anticipating, and the intrigue doesn't let up. It's one of the most fascinating documentaries I've ever seen, and I didn't even know it was going to be a documentary. Mary Poppins Returns. It wasn't perfect, but there was a lot of magical memories to be made with the first Mary Poppins movie. I was hoping for new adventures, and with the character as unbound as Mary Poppins, the possibilities seemed endless. What we got instead was a movie that rehashed the events of the first movie, beat for beat, only making slight changes that were mostly inferior. There's clearly effort being made, but it's all happening within the very boring constraints of repeating what came before. And since Mary Poppins is a character famous for breaking through very boring constraints, it's very disappointing that her own movie won't take her advice. A Star is Born. I'd seen all the other incarnations of this movie years ago, and my primary thought was, this story is boring. Why does it keep getting remade? Bradley Cooper did absolutely nothing to change my thinking. It does feel different from the previous 3 movies, but it's a different kind of boring. I'm just baffled. Are we done? Can we stop making this movie? Sherlock Gnomes. I'm just kind of fascinated this movie exists. Romeo and Juliet just barely makes sense. It's a retelling of the story based entirely on a pun. Alright, and it'd be one thing if this new movie was kind of an anthology sequel with a whole separate story involving Sherlock Gnomes, but this sequel incorporates the characters of Romeo and Juliet to create this strange literary crossover with gnomes. It is such a strange idea that I want to see more. And honestly, the movie's pretty solid. There's a lot more that pays off than you'd think. And with Holmes and Watson being absolute ass, we can now say that Sherlock Gnomes is the best Sherlock Holmes movie adaptation of 2018. Damsel. I just wanted to shout this one out because I've barely heard anybody talking about this. It's an outstanding comedy and an equally good commentary on what it feels like to be a damsel. The way the story unfolds is a lot of fun, and the setting of the West with its grandiose traditions really lets the parody aspect of this movie hit especially hard. I'd highly recommend this one. Avengers: Infinity War. I was almost not going to include this on my list, simply because I was living in the post-Infinity War world where I had already enjoyed the movie, but I can't ignore the insane hype I had in the pre-Infinity War times. I was so excited to see all of these characters I had been watching in their respective movies come together for a thrilling, comical, and fun adventure. And I got exactly what I wanted. This was extremely watchable, and it's hard to even fathom being that excited to watch a movie again. Next Gen. This is the movie that had my favorite moment in an animated movie of this year. The ending sequence is genius in the way it combines the physical with the emotional in one simultaneous stream of action, and the result is so powerful. The whole movie is also great, with a very bold theme about violence and some great violence. And who knew John Krasinski made a fucking fantastic robot? Shrek Retold. This is such a fascinating movie-going experience that I genuinely think it should be put into textbooks. It is wholly captivating to watch a movie you're familiar with, retold in hundreds of different styles, and while the effect is usually ridiculous and hilarious, there's an overall sense of actual admiration for the movie. The mockery of this movie has gone so far that it's circled back to actual respect, and it is truly spectacular to somehow see two opposite feelings coexist at such extremes. I've never seen a movie like this, and it's genius. Avengers Grimm, Time Wars. Usually when Asylum makes mockbusters, the concept is a barely changed rehash of what they're capitalizing off of. So I was unprepared for them to come out with such a bizarre premise to capitalize off of Infinity War. It's fairy tale creatures teaming up to form a murdering superhero group in a sequel where they travel through alternate dimensions in order to stop an ocean goddess from taking over the land. There's a good chance this is a result of lazily matching together disparate, uninspired ideas, but it still results in a shocking display of imagination, intentional or not. It's not a particularly fun movie to watch, but it's surprisingly weird. A Quiet Place. I can't not mention how cool this movie was. The gimmick of having to remain silent isn't just fun and creative, but also leads to an entirely new way of watching movies. Ordinarily, you aren't breaking down a movie into its technical components while watching it, but this movie forces you to think about sound in such a unique way that I never see movies pull off. It has an effect of making you want to be silent yourself, and in that way, guides you into the experience of the characters in an utterly genius way. And thankfully, the movie's a great, thrilling experience on top of all this. I'm just in awe at how one very simple idea had such an innovative impact on the way the audience experienced the movie. Mamma Mia, Here We Go Again. I do enjoy ABBA's music, but the first movie musical was ass. It reeked of people wanting to finish filming as soon as possible so they could get things over with. A sequel seemed destined for failure since it would not only be associated with the first movie, but it'd have to depend on ABBA's second-tier music since the best stuff was already in the first movie. Not to mention, this was going to be a prequel, which was astonishing because the original story was barely worth telling in the first place. I had high expectations for a mess of a movie, and what I got was a movie that shockingly worked. As it turns out, the backstory this movie touched on was actually much more interesting than the original story. Everyone was putting in a lot more effort this time around, with Lily James being so charming that it almost seems impossible. And ABBA's got plenty of great music to fill a second movie. This movie even managed to have an effective emotional ending, which I could have never predicted. I'm just in awe that this wasn't awful, and that it was actually good. That's amazing. Bohemian Rhapsody. I like Queen a lot. If there was going to be a movie made after Queen, it would feel appropriate that the storytelling have the same nuance and innovation as the band's music. Instead, we get a movie that spells things out in such an obvious and uninspired way that it's actually offensive to watch. Queen's merits should have no trouble speaking for themselves, and yet, this movie is relentlessly pandering, as if it thinks Queen is so unimpressive that it needs all the help it can get. I'm glad this movie is cultivating more interest in Queen, but if you love this band, you should hate this movie. The Happy Time Murders. 10 years ago, they announced a dark comedy murder mystery involving puppets, and I loved the high-concept parody. After a lot of waiting, the movie finally came out, and I mostly enjoyed it. It delivered a lot of what I had wanted. But the movie actually established its grittier, more adult spin so well that it felt less like a parody and more like another way to tell a puppet movie. This was impressive in its own right, and probably an overall better move for establishing more credibility with the art of puppetry. But I do wish there had been more of a parody element. The Cloverfield Paradox. I'm sure making 10 Cloverfield Lane an entry into a new Cloverfield franchise was a lazy move, but I thought it was a great movie, and I was excited at the possibility of an anthology revolving around various monsters. The Cloverfield Paradox failed to stir any of that excitement. I appreciated that it felt distinct from the first 2 Cloverfield entries, but beyond some appreciably strange sci-fi moments, the lack of momentum made it a real chore to care about what was going on. This franchise is a weird mess now, and I'm definitely curious to see what happens from here. The Grinch. I don't think this could have been stopped. Someone is going to cash in on The Grinch, and it will probably keep happening. But no, Illumination did not deliver anything remotely extraordinary with their rendition. In a decision I assume was financially motivated, so little time is spent stealing Christmas, and way too much time is spent with the, comparatively, highly mundane preparations involved in stealing Christmas. They also didn't seem to trust that one of the most iconic grumpy characters would be enjoyed by audiences if he was grumpy, and decided to make him more of a sad loner instead, which was such an enormous mistake that I can't even fathom how it possibly happened. There are so many egregious storytelling errors that I feel like you could spot a new fuck-up with every viewing. The Zen Diaries of Gary Shandling. A joke that I frequently made was being a huge fan of Gary Shandling. The joke was that no one I knew had ever heard of Gary Shandling, and it was funny to pretend to be obsessed over some actor who didn't matter. So when this documentary came out, I set out to watch it with the most ironic of intentions. And I had never realized that Gary Shandling was so far away from some actor who didn't matter. This documentary didn't just highlight his spectacular creative achievements, but it delved into the mindset of Gary, how he thought about things, and how he felt about things. It was one of the most personal documentaries I had ever seen, and some combination of the excellent filmmaking and the way Gary's life personally resonated with me did the unexpected. It made me unironically obsessed with Gary Shandling, which in and of itself is kind of ironic, which is ironically the exact kind of joke Gary would appreciate. It was an experience that will probably blow my mind more than anyone else's, but I'm so thankful I was able to learn about a remarkable performer. And now I've discovered a great new paradox. If you joke about liking a lame comedian and the comedian likes your joke, is there actually a joke? So those are the movies of 2018 that I had the most to talk about, but there are other movies that I really liked or really disliked. If you're upset that you didn't get to see a full list, I've got a link in the description to my Letterboxd where you can see all 125 movies I saw ranked from best to worst. So if you're curious, check out the list and share in the comments below how I fucked everything up.
Anyway, that's all from me. Now get the fuck out of my house!